Hello everyone, and welcome to what is now, I think, the 6th of the digital talks. This week we've got Fabio here, who's going to give us a talk on the understanding conflict in the midst of urban riots in the US. We have got a presentation to work with, and we'll have, as usual, a talk followed by some discussion afterwards. But I think first, Fabio wanted us to introduce ourselves, so I don't know whether you want to start, Fabio, or suggest what you would like to know about everyone, or what would be a good place for you.
Well, first of all, it would be saying like welcome to everyone. I think it would be important for us to know why are we interested in this topic. I mean, are we interested in understanding what is happening in the US, or where do I come from? I think it's important to know the place of location to see where do we stand geographically. I think that's useful. What brings you here? And I think that's a good way to get a sense of where are we from and what brings us to this space.
Okay, well, if we start maybe with Amina, and then we will work around the whole group. Usually we do it where if you say the name of the next person, they can then introduce themselves.
So hello to everyone. I'm happy to see some of those who I already know, but also some new persons. So for those who don't know me, I'm Amina. I'm the international project manager with Asfar. And together with Luke, we are doing this digital talks projects for now maybe 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, and we hope to continue with this project. As far for this topic, initially something that's interesting for me is actually when we think about riots or any kind of protests, we don't think about them in any kind of like a conflict, just like people not saying that they're not really happy with something, but I don't feel with them as a conflict. So when Fabio introduced this idea about this as a topic, I found it very interesting. And I would like to hear maybe from Luis.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Luis Monroy. I'm an international relations lecturer here at Javeriana University in Colombia. I recently hosted and moderated an event on the US riots and the George Floyd case. So I'm really interested in this, and particularly because of my research career, I've had the chance to look in depth at different protests, like the Bosnian 2014 protests here in Latin America last year in November, and of course my interest in what is going on right now in the United States, particularly its kind of global effects and what we can learn as societies by looking at that particular case study. I would like Patricia Radovani to continue.
Thank you. Well, I am a new member. I just started like 6 weeks. I'm a student of international relations, and I kind of felt this very important subject that I kind of want to learn it, because I think it's important to think about human rights, and most of the things that's right now happening in the world is pretty politically orientated, and I kind of want to know more about this topic and discuss with people. So think some ideas, and yeah, I will give it to Luke, right?
Okay, so I will briefly introduce myself. I am, as Amina said, I'm Luke. I'm here in Bosnia as well, in Sarajevo, and I am the European Solidarity Corps volunteer with Asfar, and so I'm working with Amina on the Digital Talks project. I am interested in this subject because I think that we are in an interesting point where we are seeing, not for the first time, but we're seeing a very current expression of conflict in the US, which I think we all look to as a sort of ideal place in many regards, not ideal in many others, but I think that the fact that we are seeing this conflict there right now puts a lot of pressure on us to think about how different forms of conflict come back again and again, or can change in different circumstances. So if I, maybe Aminu next.
Hello, my name is Amin Bonifacio from Ghana. I'm the managing director for Massive Visioning Enterprise. And I'm interested in this topic because I'm currently doing a research and I'm trying to assess the role of sustainable peace building in community development. So when I saw the topic, understanding conflict in the midst of urban routing in the US, I was very, very interested in knowing more about it to see the connection between that and then my research work here in Ghana. Thank you. I'll call on Steve to continue. Steven.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm based in Tel Aviv in Israel, but I'm originally from New York and I have family still in the US. So of course it's a bit personal. And I'm particularly interested in kind of the long-term impacts. What, if any, impact this will have in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years? And I will call on Maria. Oh, there's two. Maria F.
Hi everyone. Yeah, those both Marias are on my devices. Hope everyone's okay. Yeah, I'm interested in this topic because I think it's important to understand what's going on around the world. I think we can all learn from each other and see how we can support each other. And I'm based in the UK. I work in the health and fitness industry. And I'll pass it on to Sena.
Hello, I'm Sena from Turkey. I study at university and my department is political science and international relations. That's why I want to understand how you analyze conflicts and want to work for my country. That's why I'm really interested in such digital talks. Thank you. I want to pass to Ramiz Aliyev.
Hi everyone, my name is Ramiz. I'm from Azerbaijan, from Sumqayit. So I'm in use for more than 15 years, and I'm interested about solving conflicts between community and also in the nationalities. So because this topic is interesting for me. So I will pass to Simay Kabak.
Hi everyone, I am Simay and I'm from Turkey. I want to really look at different way to this topic because it is really important and interesting for me. Thank you for digital talks. I will pass to Anuli.
Hi everyone, my name is Anuli. I'm from the UK, but I'm originally from Nigeria. So I work as a freelancer, so I go to schools and I promote social action within young people, especially on a local context. So even though this topic is from a US standpoint, as a Black person in the UK, I feel very entwined in the topic, especially from the standpoint where in the UK, protests and riots have been happening recently, and we've also had backlash to our riots with like fights with the EDL and football lads. So it's quite interesting. I would like to pass it on to... Has Stephen gone?
Yeah, I think the only
person I went. Shaniz?
Yeah.
Yeah, Shaniz.
Everyone, I'm Shanice and I work at Asfar, originally from the UK but also in Sarajevo at the moment. And as I think many people know, I've just finished my MA in Reconciliation and Peace Building. So I'm quite interested in this subject anyway, particularly in relation to our wider work on conflict resolution. And just as a general individual, I follow what's been going on in the United States, so I'm quite interested in hearing more, and particularly from someone else's perspective.
Super, I think that's everyone introduced. So if we now hand over to Fabio, if you want to go ahead.
Well, perfect. Let's do a couple of things. If everyone wants to intervene and wants to ask questions or bring a point as I'm talking, feel free to do so. You can either do it like sending a message to the Zoom text box to Luke, and Luke can like moderate those questions as I present in a way of doing it. Something that is, I think, important to state from the get-go is like I am not providing here a solution. I am providing a way of thinking and a framework, right? And the way this has happened is related to my research that I've been taking. I am Colombian as well. And as you can imagine, when your country has conflicts, you're always interested in peace building because you want to help your home country. But for reasons of life, I ended up living in South Africa. That is another country that also had like different conflicts, right? Something that would be important to mention, given that like we're talking about protests and the importance of protests, is to remember that yesterday in South Africa, we were celebrating the Soweto uprising. That's an uprising from high school and primary school students during apartheid in 1976 that were murdered and assassinated by the apartheid regime. Black bodies killed in South Africa, a black continent mostly, right? So that sets the foreground in a way to think that conflict, protests, and violence are not necessarily disconnected. That's what I'm trying to present here. And I think that I want to challenge a little bit the way we use the language and the way we use representation for understanding conflict and peace. Because to an extent, we seem to usually try to think that like peace is totally absent from conflict. And that conflict is the absence of peace, right? So one way of understanding representations is just basically going to Google. So the interesting thing about Google is that Google is not as biased as we are, but it's as biased as humanity is to an extent, because it's what people look for. So like basically what I'm going to show you is a lot of images at the beginning, and I'm going to play a little bit with our ideas on how we conceive the idea of conflict, right? So if you check this idea of conflict, like it seems like conflict is a dispute between people, right? And it's framed as something that like a disagreement, right? So like you have a conflict about who pays the bill. You have a conflict about like if someone needs to pay a bank a certain amount of money. But as soon as we start to bring a societal dimension into the idea of conflict, it changes completely. So that brings the question about how do we understand conflict, right? And I think one of the best ways in which we can understand conflict, please bear with me, I'll try to show you 2 videos. They are like not that long, but I think they're quite important to see how conflict can be understood by different sectors in society. And both of these videos make reference to the US. And one of them makes explicit reference to what happened with the murder, assassination, killing of George Floyd and like thousands of bodies in the US, right? So the first one is I have this one like from this woman. I don't know if you can recognize her. She's famous. She's a billionaire. And I think she's one of the Kardashians. I'm really bad in pop stuff. So but there was an interesting thing that happened with her, and is that like a couple of years ago. Let me change the share screen here. Hey, look, if you can help me here, trying to change the screen that I'm sharing. Let's see, how is this? Well, let's keep going. I'll send. Ah, yeah, great. New share. So let's go to this one. Yeah, and this is a Pepsi commercial from 2017. You should be able to see it now.
Not now, no. I don't know. Amina
okay,
may
wait
be
1
better
second.
placed to know how to.
How now?
Yes, yes.
So it's interesting to think what image we get about what a protest is, right? And what it represents and who it represents and who is like, if you see in this image about a protest, it looks like, well, I mean, they changed a little bit the music because obviously this is copyright infringement, but it sounds like a pop party, right? And it doesn't necessarily relate to what is, but this was a TV ad, which reflects two things. Societally, it seems that protest is gaining some salience to the extent that like a soda company decides to make an ad about protest. And second, she portrays an understanding of what is the role of how a protest works in a particular society. In this case, the case of the US. On the other hand, I'm going to show you this other video. Can you see this image of this lady? With the t-shirt of George Floyd, can you see this? Okay, so I'm going to play it.
We can see it, but we can't hear.
No, I will play it now. So please pay really good attention to what she's saying, because I think it's a good summary of what is happening with the protest now.
We couldn't hear the last one, so I don't know whether we'll be able to hear this.
Ah, well, let me see if I put greater audio. Let me see. I'm unplugging my. See if that works.
Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. There is, Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
So clearly, those two videos set a different understanding of what is protest and how we understand protest, right? One is a fictionalized understanding of a protest, and the other one is a little bit more raw description of what a protest is. However, what is interesting between these two videos is that one clearly highlights the political nature, and the other one almost frames it a little bit as a consumeristic device, right? So you're trendy as this famous model because you protest, right? Whereas the second one makes explicit societal grievances within a particular society. And then like the question that we need to ask ourselves is, this is not new, this is relevant because it's happening in the US, but this is not new. I mean, and that's why I make the question, did they exist before Twitter? Of course they did. What is the Champs-Élysées in France? A place that we try to go and visit when we go on holidays to France, but we forget that this street is this wide for a reason. And is that like back in the day, in the French Revolution, French citizens were doing roadblocks. So basically they did the street wider so they couldn't block it with furniture. And that is France, right? But we can keep going. We can check what happened in Syria, how the conflict in Syria started. People were protesting. What happened in Libya with the fall of Gaddafi? People started protesting. The Arab Spring, we have different cases with different outcomes, right? We have the Occupy protest that happened pretty much in the north. We also have what is known as the Battle of Seattle that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we have all the liberation movements after the Second World War in which organizations started to protest, and at some point they escalated into armed conflict. I mentioned South Africa again because the story of this country is that people decided to wage armed conflict after decades of trying to change things through protest, peaceful protest, or less peaceful protest, right? Carnation Revolution, Russian Revolution, French between conflict and protest. Like if you protest, it should be peaceful. everyone should go happy. So it's kind of like a Hakuna Matata, like Timon and Pumbaa go to protest, right? But that's not the case. To protest is to disrupt. When you complain, you protest. And complaining is disruptive. Of course, there are degrees of disruption, right? But like we seem to usually tend to assume unconsciously that a protest should, by all means, be everything but disruptive or violent, because then it stops being a protest. And then this also brings other questions about like, what is violence? I mean, is violence to yell at a police officer that killed someone? Is violence to break a glass window of a bank? Is violence to build to burn an unused building? Is violence to burn a parked vehicle? You know, and those are like in the category of violence at the same time as hurting other citizens or members of the state forces constitute violence, right? But we seem to put them, all of them, in the same basket. So how can we think about how people protest, or is it violent to do a graffiti? Some people claim it is, and it's important to think about how we understand and misrepresent conflict and protest and violence. So what I have is a couple of images here. I just basically wrote country conflict in Google, and this is what I found. So it seems like when we talk about conflict, usually it involves guns, it involves tanks, and it involves Africa, which sounds a little bit racist, to say the least, right? Because we're forgetting that Europe was built on the basis of war. That happened 400 years ago. We forgot it, but it's part of the history, right? So that's something to think about. How do we understand conflict? But if we check again, this is what we find when we Google riots. So in riots, we seem to see more flames. Disturbingly and interestingly, we see more brown skins in these images. So what says about who we understand to be riotous or not? You know, we forget that the French rioted, and the French were rioting last year in Champs-Élysées, right? You have like an event 2 days ago, 3 days ago in the UK with a lot of white dudes. But then why is representation in a way like more keen on showing a particular kind of body as opposed to others, right? And it links with the way we have like particular stereotypes of how we understand what is a protest and what is not a protest. This is what I found when I Googled riots, country riots. Basically, those are the two keywords. And this is when you type protest. So yeah, there's some fire in the background in Lebanon, but then we see more white people. When the news cycle is actually representing protests of people claiming to respect Black bodies. So this presents questions about how we understand something in a category. A definition for A or B seems to apply to a particular group. Is not a category, it's a prejudice. It is not working. So if people protest, people from gray to green can protest. If particular people are the only ones that protest, then you don't have a definition, you have a stereotype. And that's part of the problem of how we understand conflict, because we have two problematic distinctions. One is that like if you protest, there's no conflict, so Hakuna Matata, right? And the ones who protest tend to riot, tend to be browner, which in a way takes out the political value of their demands, right? But then what do we say about the Arab Spring? Was it valuable? Was it less valuable because they were browner? No. They had political claims about human rights, political rights, and freedom. And they chose to manifest their mobilization in a particular action that took a violent spin for several reasons. And this is interesting because this is what, like, something that is interesting because this is when you like type like a Tunis protest, right? And it's a little bit of a mixture in terms of the representation. Well, let us not forget that this became a symbol of the Arab Spring and the promise that the Arab Spring represented for several countries in the world. So when we go again, and then this is the Black Lives Matter protest, we see differences in the way they're being represented, right? and what those differences tells us about how we understand conflict. Because if we're going to solve something, we need to be really careful of how we understand it beforehand. Otherwise, we might like be proposing solutions that are not necessarily adequate, or we might be misrepresenting the diagnosis of the problem. So the solution might not be adequate for that context, right? And I have this twice for some reason. But this is like really interesting. What I was saying, like this is what was my point about the Tunisian Revolution. The Tunisian Revolution. So like there's several differences that we need to think about. The first difference is the nature of the context. Of course, the US is not the UK. The US is not South Africa. The US is not France. And that changes the way in which protests take place. There's something that has been like termed in the literature for a long time ago, and is what they call repertoires. That is basically the way people tend to protest. There's something that they do here in South Africa that is really hard to explain, but when people protest, they dance. Really, they dance. And it feels like a party. But they're expressing that they're upset, right? So, and in the same way that when you go and you see like some protests in the north, what you see is like white people walking quite fast with signs, and then like, okay, let's go home, you know? So every country has different ways of expressing protest. Why do we try to use a blanket to describe all of them as the same? And the other thing that is important to think is about like, what are the difference about between protests of countries that are more democratic or less democratic? And that's a tricky distinction because we could easily agree that Russia is not necessarily open for political contestation, right? The US is a little bit more ambiguous because you say you're a democracy, but if the police gets to you, you won't feel like you live in a democracy, right? And then you can see it on the videos when they're shooting at protesters with pepper guns and other things in the US. So it seems like this perception of how democratic the state is can affect the way you mobilize. And as we saw in the video of the activist that was saying like that you should be grateful that like we just want things like justice, not revenge, explains some tension with the understanding of how democratic the country is or a country is. And that's important, right? Another thing is like that is important to understand this relation between protest, riots, and conflict is the nature of the demands. If you see the protests in the US, the protests in the UK, the protests in France, the current protests in South Africa, when they take place, because there's quite a few taking place every now and then, they appeal to the state to fix stuff. There's a difference in the appeal. If I appeal to change the state, it's different if I ask the state to fix it. The first one is saying like, this is my constitution, please respect it, please enforce it, please fulfill the social contract, as this lady mentioned. If I'm saying like, no, we want something else, like throw that document to the rubbish bin, we want like a new country altogether, we have a different nature of the demand that is taking place. And that changes the way conflict can be manifested, because if we're talking about something where you appeal to the state, it's less likely to become violent. But as the legitimacy of the states come down, the likelihood of people expressing demands that want to change the structure itself becomes more difficult. They're talking about police reform or police defunding, but they're not saying like changing the state. Nobody's saying changing the electoral system, right? Nobody's saying like, let's change the structure of the military in the US. So that explains why like there can be some violence, and it will happen in this individual because these are unstable systems, but it won't become a battlefield of sorts, right? And then the question of why they're more violent or less violent, it depends on the country. It depends, and this is a term that is used sometimes in the literature, it depends on the culture of protest in the repertoires. In some countries, burning stuff is actually part of the way you get to be heard. For example, in South Africa, there's this term that they use that they say, if it burns, it leads politicians to get things done. So when there's protests in the townships, the poor neighborhoods of South Africa, what you usually see is people burning in some cases, not all of the times, but in some cases you see them burning schools, hospitals, libraries, because if they try to protest peacefully, nobody's going to pay attention to them. And it's quite interesting also like to reflect in why bias and the media cycle has a violence porn bias. They are more likely to report on violent protests than on peaceful protests. So if you want to be heard, it's a rational decision to think that maybe like you need to use some degree of violence, you know, like burning a vehicle or a couple of rubbish collection containers as they did in France or in the UK, you know. But that in a way illustrates how this changes according to the context. However, there's something that is important to think about it. And you need to remember that academics maybe are as fake as WWE wrestlers, but they tend to argue as much as them about the concepts they use. And we must not forget that a concept is just a vehicle. A concept is not a reality. A concept is the way you approach to understand something. So in that sense, what is a riot? What is a protest? Yes, you can find difference between them, but what is important is to understand what is the nature of the claims people are making. Are they making claims to the state, or are they making claims to replace the state? Those are two different things. I asked for the state for water, it's one claim. I asked to create a whole new institution because I don't believe the state can provide water in my lifetime, so I'm going to overthrow the regime. It's a different nature of the claim. And that can frame the way in which conflict can be manifested on different ways. The interesting thing about using riots as a vehicle to understand protests is that riots is in the borderline of becoming more violent. Because usually what happens with riots is people like say they flare up and then they can like calm down, right? But that depends on the one side on the nature of the claims that organizations are making, but also depends on the response of the state. If the state is extremely repressive and it seems to be negligent, people will more likely take upon arms. If the state is more like, okay, let's sit and talk, and let's see what we have to do and how we can solve it, we can end up seeing processes like what is happening in Lebanon, you know, or in other countries where people is protesting, talking to the government, they keep protesting, they talk to the government, or in Chile, where the government is still using a lot of violence against protesters, frame the whole conversation within a process of negotiation with the citizenry, you know. And what is important, one of the important takes of this is like conflict is greater than a guy with a machine gun. It's people within a society expressing grievances and discontent. That's conflict. And the way the countries decide to embrace it and manage it determines in a way the outcome of the conflict. A conflict that is capable of understanding what people need more likely is more effective at delivering services and goods. Whereas one that tends to see conflict as something subversive by definition most likely will see some sort of escalation, either because the government is extremely authoritarian or because the governments are extremely incompetent and negligent, right? So at the end, like we go back to these three terms, and it seems like conflict is actually like an umbrella under which protests and riots take place, right? And this is not new, and this is not something like we're just rediscovering the wheel. It's something that has happened before. It's something that has been written before. So what is important to think about this is, especially in this diagram, is there's the possibility of conflict always escalating or de-escalating. The fact that the UK is more of a democracy or the US is more of a democracy doesn't mean there will always be at peace. They can become unstable when the state loses legitimacy. Violence can emerge and lead to further grievances and demands from the citizens, which can escalate the conflicts into different ways or different demands that can change for structural changes or systemic changes, right? In the same way, when you reach armed conflict, conflict is not forever for some countries. It can de-escalate, and I'm talking about conflict within one country, not a country that is occupied like other like Palestine. You know, I'm talking about countries that are like having internal conflicts within their own boundaries, and people is fighting within their own nation. Nothing internationalized and nothing like of an occupation force. So that presents questions about how we understand conflict escalating or de-escalating within one context. Because then you can see the cases of some conflicts that actually have ended. Yes, people is protesting a lot, Bosnia and Herzegovina. But conflict is not re-emerging. Mozambique, similarly. Angola, after they finished the conflict because the government defeated the rebels, people is starting to protest after 7 or 12 years of government. So that shows that like it seems like they are related in a way, right? However, what makes a conflict more or less violent is not just a single factor. There are several factors playing there. One of them is the nature of the state. Another one is the nature of the government institutions. And that speaks a lot about the conditions in which things take place. The resources available to the government, the nature of the grievances. For example, let's say South Africa has a population of 60 million inhabitants, right? In this country, there's something like 250 Colombians in total. Even if we have the greatest grievance with the country, we wouldn't do anything because we don't have the size, right? So you need to have a group that can actually convey those demands. That's why it is interesting, because in the US, you see Black African Americans claiming to be underrepresented, but those voices for Native Americans are less visible within the media because they're not a big group enough to achieve that leverage, right? Also, the motivation matters. In some cases, really, people want to change the country for the good of everyone. In other countries, people just want to have access to resources, and they're mobilizing groups to take advantage of that. And we cannot take protests for granted as being good or bad. Well, we need to understand the context in which they take place, right? And that affects this diagram of escalation or de-escalation, which is a simple representation of how different stages of conflict can relate to each other. So, I mean, like playing stereotypes, given that we play a little bit with stereotypes of the South, or black bodies or bodies with melanin, we can play a little bit from the North. So if we check at this image trying to represent violence in Italy between 1966 and 73, this is according to an academic called Sidney Tarrow. You can see that like what he calls conventional events is basically protest. Confrontational events is when like people had like scuffles with police, and violent events when you have like some sort of like clashes, right? So you see these three things seem to go in parallel, like as in waves. And you can see kind of like everything goes up, and when it tends to de-escalate, it seems to go down. So that makes us think that like in a way, different ways in which conflict is expressed: peaceful protest, violent protest, armed protest, can take at the same place, the three of them. And they in a way are related to each other, but they're not necessarily the same. So we need to understand what is happening with each one of them. And for example, if you check in the US, you will be like not surprised to see like that there's an order of magnitude of peaceful protest versus the violent protest. The violent protests are marginal and are mostly happening from white supremacists and terrorists. Whereas the peaceful protests are happening from like activists from the Black Lives Matter movement and other organizations, following a history and a legacy of peaceful protests, such as the legacy of Martin Luther King, peaceful mobilization in the 60s, when they used to be like Black African Americans because they had the right to do so. So what does this mean overall? It means that like different forms of conflict are related, violent and not violent, even armed conflict as a later stage of a conflict. They can occur at the same time. But this relation depends on a series of contextual factors: political freedom, capacity to challenge the state from the people that is protesting. One that is extremely important is the legitimacy of the state. Once the state stops being legitimate, the shooting is likely to happen, because it's easier to motivate to overthrow a particular regime, right? Having said that, what is the path ahead of the USA? First comment about that is, if you hear any forecast of what is going to happen, or any prediction of what is going to happen with the US, is nonsense. We cannot see the future, right? Nobody can say what will happen with the US. However, what we can see as of now is that the state is still legitimate. So people is still protesting, but people is not using guns. For the amount of gun ownership that you have in the US, the legitimacy of the state explains to an extent why people is not shooting in the street, because you can buy easier a rifle than a pair of socks in the US. And that's extremely dangerous. And it seems to be legitimate in spite of several years of a government that has delegitimized the state for a particular sector of the society. Go ahead in what is going to happen in November when they have these elections, and what is and if the election become contentious, and if there are challenges about the legitimacy and how the state is understood as legitimate or illegitimate. In a context where the state can be further delegitimized, when there is a lot of weapons in the streets, when the legitimacy of the forces that bring law and order has been lessened. It won't take like something like the shape of an armed conflict, but you will see murderous violence taking place if that path takes place. If the government, on the other hand, changes some of their policies, gains the moral high ground trying to reform the state, we will see that people will keep protesting peacefully, because that is in their culture of protest. We should not forget that Black African Americans are one of the strongest groups at protesting peacefully. So with that, I think, like, does this just only apply to the US? We should think about it. Before, and as Luis mentioned when he introduced himself, before we observed protests this year, there were like an uprising in protests in Latin America, in Europe, with the Gilets Jaunes, right? In the UK, Extinction Rebellion, Middle East, Africa, everyone was protesting, but then we all had to go into lockdown to an extent. And in spite of a pandemic, in some countries in the world, people is taking to the streets. And these protests will continue, because what we're facing with a recession and with all the inequality that is going to be created by this pandemic is further grievances, further demands that will be initially mobilized through protests. But depending on how the states respond and on their legitimacy, we can see them fueling conflicts that escalate into armed conflict, or can refuel conflicts that had ended, armed conflicts that had ceased to exist, can be revitalized through grievances that are further. So, and these demands are unlikely to disappear. If I was not having access to water in 12, 16, 18 months time, I would still want to have my water if I survive the pandemic. You know, plus the grievances that can be created in the unequal allocation of resources, grants, and services. So with that, we can go into questions, have like a little bit of a conversation. For those who do the social media thing, that's my Twitter account. I'm really bad at it, but who knows?
Thank you very much, Fabio. In that case, we will open up to some questions. So if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to say, please go ahead. You can either send a message, or you can go ahead. I think Luis has said he's got a question, so if you want to go ahead.
Okay, Fabio, thank you for a great presentation. I really like the academic tone and the insistence on being critical. And on that tone, I just want to make a comment and then ask you a question. I hear your voice of being more critical of the media we consume and how we interpret these terms according to what we see. But let's go back to the case of the United States. And in my particular case, when I heard George Floyd, the first thing that I remembered was Rodney King, was the early 90s. It was an episode of police brutality, an episode of racism, a video that went, I don't know if I can say viral at that time, but it was spread worldwide. And then nothing happened. You know, there were the riots in LA, things occurred, but you know, the structural racism still maintained, the debate faded away, they elected Barack Obama. Maybe that represents some sort of change, but it, you know, what is happening now asks the question of, you know, how much did that period change from the early 90s to today? And now we have the same. You know, we have George Floyd, we have a motto, we have video, but now there's the internet, there's globalization, there's every country has access to this and in real time with big effects. Do you think globalization matters in this debate of how we consume the media? Does it make a change that it's this global, or is it going to be, you know, something similar to what happened to the Rodney King case?
Okay. Shall we take more answers, or you want to? Would you prefer me to respond right now?
You can respond now.
Okay, I think there's a couple of things, and you rightly say, like I mentioned the cases of '93 and how this happened, and I think like there's an important thing that like we cannot deny in the study of conflict and the study of protests, and in the role of globalization has taken place. Not only we're more interconnected with each other, but also we have more access to information from other countries. But the thing is, like globalization is not only economical. So what we're seeing now is not the economic terms of a globalization process, but the technological shifts that have accompanied that globalization process. So whereas the Rodney King video in '93, when you have the riots in LA and all these things, was like a sketchy video that could show the beating of a Black American, in a way, like the response in the '90s, like was buffered by the fact that Clinton was a president, someone that was seen like with positive eyes within the African American community, and the legitimacy of the state wasn't that there. I think what is a big changer here, and is related to what you say, is the role of social media, because now there's proofs that now it's not only that I'm being discriminated, but you have a video of it. You know, so the proof is there. So it's harder to deny. So whereas usually when you have the state and you complain against the state, if there's no proof, it's harder to see it. But now we see videos of abuses everywhere in the world from the police, and that challenges the legitimacy. Of course, the way the state will change, if it changes, I mean, we cannot know how this will change. I think it will boil down to what happens in the elections, and in a sense, it depends on in the US, and it depends on how the people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement can influence the policy agenda, and not only through going into the street, but also electing officials at national, local, Senate, and Congress levels, right? So that's really important because that can change the power balance. But we're in a process in which societies are building, in a way, their own clusters. So if we compare the Facebook feeds of all of us in this session now, we'll see different imagery about what is happening here. So like I think that's a possibility, but presents a risk. I think like the media now, the accessibility allows us to see more things that before we didn't used to see. But it presents a risk because we're forgetting that we consume media through our own biases. And that can become really tricky because someone can find a video in their Twitter feed or WhatsApp networks or in their Facebook or whatever you use, saying that that's actually like a hoax, that this guy wasn't killed at all. And I'm sure that happens, but we don't get to see it because we're maybe not in those networks. So I think that the other implication of this happening is like, and it also will go back a lot to what happens in November, is the US has been losing the moral high ground. The US is an empire that is declining, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, right? And other powers are taking advantage of this. As we speak, the advances that are happening in Libya, Syria, China, India in the border, everyone is like, it's like free fire. People is taking advantage of this to try to mobilize their own agendas. Because in a way, the US was believed to be the world policeman or the good guy. And that's the legacy of the Second World War because they defeated Nazis. And that's true, and we cannot deny that. But I think now it's gonna be harder to maintain that discourse because inconsistencies are visible with videos that everyone can.
Is everything okay? There is a comment, I don't know if you can see it, Fabio, from Stephen.
No, can you read it for me, please?
I can read it. I don't know if Stephen, if you still have time, whether you want to read it or whether I shall read it out.
No, can you go ahead and read it? Thanks.
Yeah. So Stephen has said that I think there should be a distinction between violence in protests when government is preventing people from protesting or voting or repressing information versus when there is a feeling of anger, frustration over structural inequality, but there exist non-violent methods of achieving change via voting, electing leaders, etc., as well as who the violence is directed against. For example, the Confederate statues or random stores or police stations or passers-by.
Okay, like I think like what Steven says is totally on point. I mean, there's an interesting stream within the literature, led mostly by someone that is called Erika Chenoweth, that they have been researching the impact of nonviolent resistance. So it has been found that nonviolent resistance is more effective to achieve change against authoritarian or repressive regimes, right? I think like it's more harder to qualify when there's anger or frustration over structural inequality, right? But I think like nonviolence is more effective to achieve change. And I'm not like in a way judging the means. I'm just trying to present the possibility of the relation between these different expressions. And the between 1950s to 1967 protested peacefully all the time, and massacres happened, and people was not paying attention. And sooner or later, like if the state is unresponsive, remember that this is not necessarily a one actor only. It's a relational process. So it's like a chess game, what you do and what the other does. So if the state actually is able to embrace and respect protesters peacefully, it's quite unlikely that violence will emerge. But if the state is dismissive and violent, violence is more likely, not necessarily certain, it's more likely to take place. And that's totally on point.
There is another question from Lewis. I don't know whether he wants to, you want to go ahead, Lewis.
I found the chat. I'm getting good at Zoom. So.
Okay, you've got the chat.
Yeah, so like Luis is asking, like thinking about Latin America, what do I think about the infiltration tactics of governments to turn protests into riots and violence? That happens everywhere, and that's part of the government, where if it is a democratic government or a less democratic government, how do we remember that this is a political game, and that implies moral positions, right? So if the government looks restrained and the protesters look violent, the government can justify the use of violence. So in the case of Colombia, there's videos where you can see policemen dressed in plain clothes just starting to throw stones, and then they go back, like they find another video of the guy going in a motorcycle hugging the policeman. Not because he loves them, but because they're partners and they're working together, right? So I think that has always been a tactic, because if you try to legitimize and incite violence, you can justify violence. That's why it's more complicated for governments to justify violence when you have like an unarmed person. Remember, the Black Lives Matter movement was their chant in the last years: hands up, don't shoot. Right? It's totally unconfrontational, and it links with what Steven was saying about like that nature of protest is more likely to succeed, as opposed as they were peddling stones. Something that's interesting is like you seem to see more white people in riots, or leading riots, or leading to riots, right? So I think like there's a center called the ICNC that they do like a couple of interesting analyses about nonviolence and their effectiveness, and how it works and how it doesn't. I think that's something that can be seen. However, nonviolence is valid and is necessary, but it's not necessarily always the outcome. I'm not saying which one is better. I'm saying what can happen. And that thus I'm not making any normative claims about like, this should happen, this is better than the other. I'm just describing what is happening in a way, or what could happen in a way.
Okay, super. Does anyone else have any questions? We've probably got time for another question, maybe one more before we start to finish up. If anyone does have a question now, they can go ahead and either unmute themselves and ask. Otherwise, we will maybe see if Fabio, you have anything you want to finish up by saying, and then we can move to close the talk. in that case,
Anuli has a question. What could be an effect of the government banning protests? I presume you're talking about the US government, right? I think like there's something that we need to take into account when we talk about the US government, and is that it's a federal government. So it depends on the states. No? So where the government tries to do this through a federal measure, it will depend a lot on the state where that takes place. And then like the responses will be different. So let's say for example in California, let's say in New York, which are usually democratic states, this is less likely to happen. Remember, it is an electoral year. You cannot alienate your electorate, banning them from the right to vote, right? So like there's that concern, but on the other hand, like there is a higher concern of people being more likely to use other means of protest if the state does that. That basically would be like an escalation of the conflict. Something that was quite interesting, I might be getting it wrong, but I think in Seattle, there was a park in front of the municipality that was being occupied by protesters, and Trump said like, you should go and beat them and whatever. And the mayor decided, no, this is not going to, what is going to happen. I'm just going to talk with them. And what he did, he de-escalated the conflict, speaking through them. So I think that like it's like a chess game. Every movement has a response, and most likely the government wants to promote negotiations. It is unlikely that people will escalate conflict unless they really want something else. Right, and then because it also depends on the agendas of the people involved, which is what we usually see in peace building processes, especially when you have warlords. But that's not the case of the US, right? So I think like we'll have to see. I think it's quite unlikely, but we'll have to see. Especially because I think that what has changed in the US is that there's a shift in the media, and in a way like the upper hand is on the side of the protesters in terms of the representation of what is happening. The state has tried to do this, but it hasn't worked for them. I mean, Trump saying that like new jobs were being created and George Floyd would be happy in heaven because of that. Like he cannot capture the narrative for the majority of the country that is protesting, not for his voter base, for the hardcore Trump voters. He can do whatever he wants and people will believe it because Facebook and Twitter tell them so.
Okay. There is a comment. I don't know if you've seen, Fabio, from Luis again in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, I'll read it. Like Luis mentioned that it is interesting to focus on the difference between protesters in the US calling for defunding and abolishing police, and politicians focusing on police reform and changing guidelines for police manuals. Yes, I think like this is an interesting debate that the people are saying defund the police, but they're not saying defund the police and just that. It's just allocating that money to other resources, right? So putting it in community work, putting it in health work, putting it in the provision of public services. So what it's saying is allocate resources where the needs are taking place for communities of color. And that's the demand. Whereas some politicians are just saying like we just need to change the manual. But let us not forget that most, not most, but a big number of policemen in the US are former soldiers that were in war. The US has been in war since the 2000s, with a lot of people traumatized, leaving the army, coming into the police. And that might be like extremely tricky when you have people that have been trained to kill to try to solve a dispute. Because it's the logic of war when you need the logic of negotiation. Senna mentions here, what do you think about strategies for countries maybe which are surrounded by conflict regions and want to stabilize the region in peace? I think that's tricky. I think like, I mean, I think the best way that you can do that is through mediation and trying to get people to sit and talk. But you cannot impose what you want to see in a society where it's out of the best intentions. Because you're trying to impose a reality in a context which might not necessarily want that. I mean, a peace to be sustainable needs to emerge from within. So what any country can do is to facilitate conversations and promote conversations and like just keep pushing in spite of the responses. Sooner or later, it will happen. But intervening and trying to achieve peace has never worked. The only thing that you can achieve is appeasement through violence, but that's not peace. That's conquering, right? And then you can see the example in the US, biggest army of the world, Afghanistan, what are they doing? They're retreating after I don't know how many years. Iraq, what happened? They created ISIS. So if you're going to intervene to promote peace, through peace building, not through war.
Super, thank you for that too. I think at this point we are going to have to finish up. I think we've gone for about an hour, which is what we usually aim to do. So thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts, Fabio.
No, thank you guys for having me. It was a pleasure.
I hope everyone, all of you, found it useful to be here.